Hey guys, it's GP again. As you may know, 2 weeks ago I had a very cool discussion with John Vervaeke about physicalism, panpsychism, and the meaning crisis. And in the discussion, we reached the very interesting point where it turned out, first of all, that John's physicalism is not that different from the panpsychism I defend. And it also turned out that our disagreement couldn't be pinpointed to a few mistakes in the other's position. Really, we ended up agreeing that the other's position was coherent. It's just that there are a few places where we have differing intuitions which yield different metaphysics. But we couldn't really get any further than that. And what I want to do today in this video is try to talk about, in general, how I see this, how I think we can live with this sort of tension between possible worldviews. And basically, it will come down to the fact that different worldviews, which take their basis on different metaphysical intuitions, still, I mean, if you try to develop those worldviews, they will still end up pointing in somewhat the same direction, and the result is that you can actually live coherently with all of those worldviews in your mind, taking that, well, maybe this one is true, maybe this one is true, I'm not exactly sure, but at least I'm going in pretty much the same direction anyway. So we could do this with a lot of worldviews. Today I just want to talk about Vervaeke's solution to the meaning crisis with his ontology and versus Bergson's solution to the meaning crisis with his ontology. So I think the best way to go about this is I'll first talk about Vervaeke's position, and then I'll pinpoint a few specific places where I think where I have different intuitions and where that leads me, and I'll say what sort of risks this entails metaphysically, and also what I get with it metaphysically, and then I'll give some reflections about how you can fit those two together more precisely as I go along. So first off, the version of physicalism which Vervaeke defends is very far away from materialism. The entities he considers to be part of physics include not only matter, and not only particles, atoms, molecules, and so on, but also relations between those, as well as space, time, energy, and so on, and even physical laws. And that's especially where I think a lot of physicalists would challenge Vervaeke, but I think you can certainly make that point. Things like E equals mc squared is part of physics. You have to fit that somewhere in your ontology if you think that this is a real physical law that exists. So that is something that the physicalist needs to hold. And a further thing that is worth stating in Vervaeke's worldview is that in his physicalism, naturalism, there is a continuity between us and the entities of physics. And I think this is also a point where several physicalists may want to challenge Vervaeke, but I do agree with them that this is something that physicalists should hold to. Basically, the point is not that hard to make. It's the fact that, well, I, Jean-Philippe, as a whole organism, is conscious, and that consciousness cannot just pop out of nowhere. It has to be, there has to be something not that different from consciousness in my cells for that combination of all my cells in my environment to combine into my consciousness of Jean-Philippe. It can't just pop out of nowhere, as I just said. So there has to be something continuous between me and my cells. And then between my cells and my molecules, I said there has to be something continuous again, all the way down to the fundamental particles of physics. So Vervaeke will not tell us exactly what is continuous exactly across all those steps, and especially not what is exactly continuous between the fundamental particles of physics and us. We're reaching a point that is very, very far away from us, so we don't have a precise answer, at least for now, of what that continuous property is when you reach the level of fundamental particles. But at least this means that Vervaeke does not hold that physical entities down to the level of fundamental particles or something like dead matter, which is completely unconscious. There is more than physical unconscious. maybe it's not consciousness there, because he doesn't want to commit himself to panpsychism, but there is something special there. It's not just dead matter. There is something there. Now, I think this summarizes Vervaeke's ontology. And before trying to talk about his solution to the remaining crisis in relation to this ontology, I want to explain where Vervaeke's ontology can be challenged by Bergson, and how Vervaeke can try to avoid those objections and keep it worldview, and why I think for at least some people who have different intuitions, they will be pulled more towards Bergson. So we can take some of the famous arguments against physicalism. Let's say we take Chalmers' zombies. So the idea is this will be convincing, especially for people who have done, I think, a good amount who have a good amount of training in physical science, and who really, through that training, come to imagine physical entities as sort of dead matter. Certainly when I was doing a lot of physics, I didn't think that there was anything, about electron that could compare to consciousness or anything special. It was just dead matter, just like at my scale, and that dead matter is at the scale of electrons. There's no. That's how I conceived it, and we can very well imagine that if you just combine those fundamental particles, you get more complex stuff, but that stuff is always unconscious. So let's say I can imagine a replica of me, JP, which is physically identical, made of just the dead matter I was studying when I was studying physics. You make up a GP of all that stuff. That GP will have the same behavior as me because he follows the same physical laws. It's made of the same physical stuff. But there's nothing that tells me that this GP is conscious, because he's made up of dead unconscious matter. So why would the whole thing be conscious? It pops out of nowhere. So this would be a philosophical zombie, something that is physically identical to me but without any fundamental consciousness. Now that is something I can imagine very well if I take the idea that physical entities are dead unconscious matter, and even before trying to take a conclusion out of this, I need to say that you eventually come up with a problem if you think that this is a real metaphysical possibility, because of we mentioned too in my discussion with Vervaeke, there is first of all the problem of the paradox of phenomenal judgments. So the idea is, well, if a creature can be physically identical to me but without consciousness, then the judgments about consciousness of my zombie are very problematic, and even mine become problematic. Because, well, if my zombie is really physically identical to me and he does the same things, he will be making videos, writing articles and master theses about the fact that there's no about the fact that he's not a zombie, that there is consciousness in the world, while in this case he's completely unconscious and he doesn't need consciousness to do those things. And by the same token, there's no reason why you would trust my arguments. If I think that a zombie could write the same thing while being unconscious, there's no reason why you should trust my arguments while I'm unconscious. So there is you get paradoxes there. There's also the paradox of the evolution, the problem of the evolution of consciousness, because, well, if something physically identical to me but unconscious could do exactly the same, could have exactly the same behavior, there's no reason why consciousness would care about consciousness, and therefore there's no reason why consciousness would have selected our consciousness, but it obviously did, because our consciousness is way too complicated to be to be a mere side effect of physical evolution. So you get very deep problems if you think that Chalmers zombies are a real metaphysical possibility, and this is where Vervaeke and I will have different intuitions. We will cash out this issue in different ways. What Vervaeke does is he completely rejects the thought experiment, and similarly for other similar thought experiments, he says, well, it means the thought experiments are broken, and we can just ignore them. What I prefer to do is challenge the idea that, well, matter really is that unconscious stuff. What Vervaeke does as well, but I want to say, well, because matter isn't just that unconscious stuff, there has to be something like consciousness in that matter. That's the move which panpsychists make. So rather than dismissing the thought experiment, I accept the thought experiment but reject one of the premises, namely the idea that matter is unconscious stuff. And I think maybe the source of the disagreement here, it probably has to do with a bunch of psychological factors. We could go with the stereotypical exuberance of youth, because I'm willing to take more risks. I'm willing to, I'm at least willing to explore panpsychism because I think this is an interesting question, and I would like to, make that step of, well, what happens if you put consciousness in there? I think it's at least worth exploring. And a general remark about, trying to find truth when you're doing something as complex as doing metaphysics is, well, you'll never actually be sure that you get there, that you get to the truth. I think the best you can do is always to explore and see what things you get. And this is true, in metaphysics because it's complicated, but it's true in other disciplines as well. Even let's say it's true in sports, and it's true in all kinds of lines of work. For example, I work in the software industry, and we have to take risks and explore, knowing full well that we will never reach the perfect solution, the perfect product, but we have to try and see what works best. The best way actually to deliver a good product in real life, because we can never be certain that we have the best product. The best we can do is to just take risks, try to improve, see what works, what doesn't. And that's sort of my approach in metaphysics as well, because it's just too hard to do metaphysics. We just, you accept to take risks, you see where this goes, and you try to, and you keep doing this basically. You just iterate over all the possibilities, and you try to always refine your position, and this will lead you to have a better and better position. You'll never reach the best position, but that's the best we can do, so we can't really complain or hope for better, I think. But yeah, to come back to Vervaeke and I, so rather than like Vervaeke stopping there and not giving a precise explanation of what is exactly the stuff in matter that explains why it can combine into human consciousness, I choose to make the step which panpsychists make of, well, let's try putting consciousness in there. So that is the move which Bergson does, which panpsychists make, and obviously there is a price to pay there, because it's not something we're absolutely certain of. It's a good hypothesis, I think, but it's not something we're absolutely certain of, and it will entail having to work with a few other things. So it will entail having to fix a few other issues. The main problem you have to fix if you're a panpsychist is you have to explain how it is that different consciousnesses can combine. And I'm going to say a lot about this in this video. You can go back either to my discussion with Vervaeke or to my video on panpsychism, on the combination problem from panpsychism and the Bergsonian solution. And it comes down to the fact that, well, if you really want combinations of consciousnesses, if you really want consciousnesses to be able to combine, and especially for to explain how it is that evolution can select those combinations, you have to give those new combinations authentic causal powers. They have to be able to do things that the previous levels couldn't do, or evolution just won't care. So this ends up leading you to a version of anti-naturalism. At every level where consciousnesses combine, you have something that is making genuine choices, which are not predictable by the lower level laws. So let's say let's just take me for an example. When I make a decision, when I make a genuine choice, which is not always, but when I make a genuine choice, when I'm conscious, I make a genuine choice. If you were to observe what is going on in my brain at that moment, you would be extremely surprised by the course of elements that happens in my neurons, let's say, because I would be making a genuine choice. My causality, my human level consciousness would be impacting the lower level consciousnesses in a non-predictable way. So, as I said, you can go back to my videos on Bergson to get more details there. But and this is something that in principle, it could be tested empirically. It could be shown to be wrong. Maybe one day we'll be able to predict exactly what goes on in the brain when someone makes choices, and I would have to accept that in that scenario, Bergson is wrong. But at least for now, I'm willing to take that Bergsonian worldview very seriously, because it allows me to get a solution to the the problem of the our body problem of explaining what it is exactly, the relationship between mind and matter. It also allows me to explain the problem of the evolution of consciousness and how consciousnesses can combine. So it gets me that stuff already. Whereas if you want to play it safer, like Vervaeke does, then you don't have a precise answer to the mind-body problem. And you say that there is something, there's a continuity between us and physics, but you can't really go further. And you also don't explain precisely the evolution of consciousness. You say, well, there's a continuous story there, but you don't really provide an answer for it. So those are just the different metaphysics you get from the different intuitions. I'm willing to take a bit more risk than Vervaeke, and he's not. And now I want to discuss a little bit what this entails at the level of the meaning crisis, what those two different metaphysics can give at the level of the meaning crisis. Well, I think the main advantage of Vervaeke's position is that it's very safe, because you don't have to rely on non-naturalism. You can still be a physicalist, although a lot of physicalists, I think, would challenge strongly Vervaeke's version of physicalism, but at least you stay relatively close to current science, to the way people think right now. And a lot of people are skeptical of metaphysics right now. So I think he's doing a project that is already psychologically very viable for a lot of people, and he can still go very far within that naturalist frame. You can still go very far in terms of talking about how virtue and wisdom are real things which you can develop and grow in your life. So you can get a pretty good answer to meaning crisis this way, I think. I made a video previously about refuting debunking arguments, which I won't summarize exactly here, but I think the best move which a naturalist like Vervaeke can make, especially with Vervaeke's ontology, can make to address the meaning crisis, is to show that, well, your consciousness, which is real. In Vervaeke's version of physicalism and naturalism, consciousness is a real thing. Our conscious desires, our conscious moral intuitions, they're all real things. And then the challenge is to say, well, now that we can see that those are real things, your pleasures, your pains, and so on are real things, we need to figure out if they're, are they just isolated in your brain? Because that would still give the meaning crisis. If you were somewhere stuck in your brain where what you feel were totally subjective to you, this would really alienate you from other people and from the world. So you would still get the meaning crisis there. I think the best a good move you can make is to try to show that, well, those desires and so on, they're objective, they're real, they're not just in your mind, they're shared by lots of people, they're part of really the fabric of the world. And the way you can do this, I think, is by relying, perhaps the clearest way to do this is to rely strictly on recent research in moral psychology to show how people actually develop their morality. And what you find out is that people don't just construct their morality in their mind, and it's not that it's not really isolated from one culture to another, or maybe even not one species to another. Really, morality, our moral intuitions are some things that we have to develop by testing it in the environment. We have something that we have to test and discover in the world. We cannot just make up our own morality in our minds. We have to always test and improve this in the world. A clear way to get at least a start on this, you can make research you can do your own research, especially in the moral foundations theory. I think it's a really good way to see this. Basically what happens is we seem to have different moral taste buds. From birth we have different moral emotions, which we have evolved for different reasons. Let's say a moral emotion of disgust is used to detect what is and is not proper morally. We have a moral emotion of detect unfairness, which was used evolutionary to know which people in the group you could trust or not trust, which you could trade and not trade with. And those elementary moral emotions, as you grow, you can turn them into full-fledged moral intuitions. So, but it's something you actually have to test in the environment. When children are born, they don't have this moral sense. They just have emotions that are fairly disordered. But by interacting in the environment and also by contact with other people, they can develop more. They can take those moral foundations and actually develop their moral sense in the same way that you develop your vision or other senses. So maybe I don't know into how much detail I want to go into this here. I could maybe just give an example. So maybe when you're a kid, you at some point you discover that you can lie, and it's the first time you discover this, so you don't really know if it's good or bad. But so what you do, maybe at some point you decide to lie. You tell a lie to your parents about something, but then your parents sort of challenge you on this. They ask some questions, so you have to. You're not sure what to do. You start feeling bad, but you're not sure yet. So you tell another lie, and then this leads to a cascade of other lies until you're just stuck there and you get into trouble. And at that point, you realize, well, it was a bad thing to lie, and even subconsciously, your moral intuitions about lying will be somewhat reordered. At least if you're honest and you admit that you were wrong, your moral intuitions will be somewhat reordered and will improve over time. So that's one way in which we develop our morality, and we can say that it's something in the world that we have to develop. It's to just show what empirically happens when people try. And another way we develop, which is very useful, which will connect to what I'm going to say later about Bergson, is a way we develop morality as well is by interacting with other people. We can interacting with other people. It can be real people, or it can be even in movies or literature and so on. What we have a very strong capacity for empathy, where we can, let's say we're watching a movie, we can imagine ourselves being the hero. Our cognitive systems will mimic the hero, and this allows us to live the moral emotions of the hero. And in such a scenario, I feel those things, and what leads later, what this leads to is those other things I will feel, and subconsciously this will reorder or our moral intuitions already. It will improve them. It allows us to live accelerated lives, to test more morality when going to movies or listening to stories and so on. And that's one of the reasons why we like stories and like movies so much, why we spend so much time and money on those. It's because it allows us to develop morally. And so to just summarize what I've been saying about the best naturalist solution, I think, to the meaning crisis, you can take Vervaeke's ontology and explain how you can get a cultivation of virtue and wisdom in that ontology. I think that's already a pretty good solution to the meaning crisis. But if you're willing to take the risks which Bergson is taking, you can get even more. I mean, you get all of that, but you get even more because as I said, the consciousness is a bit more special in Bergson's ontology. Human beings have genuine choices where we're not determined by the lower levels, which can be alienating to some people. Not everyone is disturbed by the prospect that we may not have free will, but some people find it very alienating to think that, well, even let's say Vervaeke in your project where human beings can develop virtue and wisdom, maybe all that is implied, although in a very complex way, is implied by the lower levels. This is Vervaeke could, I don't want to put more words in his mouth, because he could probably do something about the weak emergence there. But lots of people, even with this kind of emergence, would still feel alienated by the fact that somehow, even if it's in a complex way, the lower levels are still the masters here, so we're not really making choices, and our virtue is sort of an epiphenomenon more than a real thing. So some people may do this, but this is definitely not an option with Bergson. Our choices are real choices which influence the lower levels in non-predictable ways. Another thing, if you go watch my video, especially on Bergson and classical theism, is that you can bridge the gap with Bergson back to classical theism, because in the same way that I am a consciousness that is containing all the lower consciousnesses of my cells and my molecules and so on. There is in lots of panpsychist theories, there are higher level consciousnesses which are made up of the consciousness of humans or the entire universe. I'm not going to go into a lot of detail here because I would repeat myself basically, but the upshot is that you can take very seriously the idea that there is a God you can pray to who will hear your prayers, will act through you in the same way that I act through my cells. We can take very seriously the idea that you should go to church, practice, and be the body of Christ with your co-parishioners. In the same way that my cells make up my body, make up the body of my mind, I can go to church and be part of the body of God. And that's a very thrilling solution to the meaning crisis. So you do get more, I think, in terms of solving the meaning crisis if you're willing to take the risks which Bergson is taking, but it is a risk, and it is a very strong existential risk you're taking as well, because if it turns out that Bergson is wrong, that maybe actually you can predict what is going on in the brain even when human beings are making choices, then it would mean that that Bergsonian worldview would fall apart. So it is a risk, but I think this is where really both worldviews, Vervaeke's position and Bergson's position, can actually help one another, because I think I'm much more willing to take the sorts of metaphysical risks which Bergson demands, now that I know how safe and still viable Vervaeke's position is. Because let's say if all as far as the solution to the meaning crisis goes is Bergson's solution, because it's sort of a risky solution, if this fails, you're left with nothing, and you could go into a very deep existential despair. But if you also know that, well, I'm fully aware that by adopting Bergson's solution, I'm taking a few risks, but I know that if they don't cash out, then I can always go back to Vervaeke's solution. And really, they go quite well together, because it's not as if it turns out that Bergson is wrong, it's not as if I wasted my time all along. I was still going into the same direction of developing virtue and wisdom. Especially maybe one good way to see it is that, as I said, a good way to develop virtue is to go, let's say, see a movie, go listen to a story where you get to embody the hero and live the moral intuitions and develop morally by living that accelerated life. It's something you can do, among other things, by going to church. You can get into the story and develop the virtue. Develop virtue by living those stories, especially since it's something you get to do physically. You get to sing and kneel and move in procession and so on. So you can actually participate in the story, and this is a good way to develop virtue. So even if it turns out, let's say, I think there are plenty of other arguments for classical theism, but let's say all is Vervaeke's solution and Bergson's solution, and at some point it turns out that Bergson is wrong. Still, you don't fall into the despair of absolute nothingness. You fall back to Vervaeke's position, and even during, let's say, all those years where you were a Bergsonian Christian, you were still developing virtue, wisdom, and so on. So it turns out that you were still going into the same direction. So just to summarize what I've done in this video, I started by saying that, Vervaeke has a very safe solution to the mind-body problem, to the meaning crisis, but it's not as rich as the more risky solution of Bergson, which gives a more in-depth answer to the mind-body problem, to the problem of the evolution of consciousness, and so on. But the risk is that you have to leave naturalism behind, and this is risky. This could turn out to be wrong. But this is a risk, I think, that is facilitated by the fact that you can be aware that Vervaeke's position is available as a fallback, and that both worldviews are actually pointing in the same direction, where you cultivate virtue and wisdom. In Bergson's worldview, you're doing more than just cultivate virtue and wisdom. You're becoming part of the body of Christ, but you are also developing virtue and wisdom. So even if you don't know of any other argument and your Bergson worldview falls, you still fall back to developing developing virtue and wisdom in Vervaeke's position, and that's still a very viable solution to the meaning crisis, in my opinion. So thank you guys for listening. I hope that was useful.